talk about the process of naming aphantasia. I'm really curious to just hear that story. What were the steps that led up to that discovery where you realized this is a phenomena that I need to name?
Okay, so the story in fact goes back quite a long way to about 2003 when I first encountered somebody, in fact, a patient who had lost the ability to visualize. So this was a delightful man in his mid-60s who we called MX in our first paper about him, though he's since come out. His name is Jim Campbell, who was referred to me by his GP because following a cardiac procedure, a coronary angioplasty, he'd lost the ability to call things to the mind's eye. So having previously been a very visual person, a vivid visualizer, he found that he was unable to recollect the faces of friends or places he'd visited, which he often used to call to mind as he got himself off to sleep. He no longer entered a visual world when he read a novel. His dreams became avisual, so he continued to have dreams, but they no longer had visual content. He would dream
Interesting.
a narrative, essentially. He said that previously, if he'd lost his keys, he'd be able to see where he'd put them, but he could no longer do that. So he gave this very compelling account of a change in his experience, and I became fascinated by this. It was not a symptom that I'd ever encountered before. It was quite difficult to fault him on neuropsychological testing, so he performed very well in all respects, except that he was no longer able to visualize and therefore scored at floor on measures of vivid visual imagery vividness. So we wrote up his case. I didn't expect the story to go too much further, but an American science journalist called Carl Zimmer wrote about him in Discover magazine, which I think is an American equivalent of New Scientist in the UK. And then over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, a trickle of people got in touch with me saying, you know, I recognize myself in that description. I'm just like NX, with the difference that I've always been that way. I've never been able to visualize. For a long time, I've been aware that there's this subtle difference between my psychological makeup and that of my friends and family. So once about 20 people had got in touch with us and had told a reasonably consistent story of lifelong lack of a mind's eye, we thought that this phenomenon deserved a name. So it had been described in the neurological literature, but using very unwieldy terms like defective revisualization or visual irreminiscence. And I thought that it deserved a catchier term. And in fact, I have quite a clear memory of the moment of naming because it was over a cup of tea with a friend in London who had studied the classics at university. And I asked him if the classics could point us in the direction of a useful name for this term, and he suggested that we borrow Aristotle's term for the mind's eye, which is phantasia, and tag an A on at the end. So that's how the term aphantasia was born.
Amazing. Was it surprising to you at all that, and I don't mean to undermine your insight here at all, but that no one had pointed this out previously? Like, this is 2015, and it really seems like you would have seen many psychiatrists would have seen thousands of people that would have been able to say these symptoms and this kind of experience. Is it surprising to you at all that it made it all the way to 2015 without someone like you saying, look, we should really put a name on this?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So it had, as I have learned more about the subject, I've discovered that this discovery is in fact a kind of rediscovery. And as early as the 1880s, Francis Galton, who was a British psychologist and the first person to try to measure the vividness of imagery, had recognized that there were people whose power of visualization was zero, as he put it. He thought that they were often scientists, interestingly. So he recognized that there were people who were what we would now call aphantasic. And then there was an American psychologist called Bill Four, who himself lacked imagery, who gave imagery questionnaires to his students and reckoned that the frequency of lack of mind's eye was a few percent. But again, he didn't give it a term. He wrote a paper about it, but didn't christen it. There was a lot of work on imagery generally over the latter part of the last century, but it tended to focus on the mid range, if you like.
Right.
It didn't take into account individual differences, and it didn't focus on the extremes. So for whatever reason, although the existence of people who lacked imagery had been recognized for a long while, and as I mentioned, there's also a neurological and psychiatric literature about people who lose imagery, there hadn't been any concerted research on people at the extremes, people lacking imagery or people with imagery as vivid as real seeing, which we went on to call hyperphantasia. And actually, I think that the simple existence of a term is very useful, and that's very
Right.
that sort of very minor contribution in a way triggered a great deal of subsequent research, kind of released a latent interest in the topic, if you like, because it just becomes much easier to know what you're talking about once you have a word with which to do so. Um,
Absolutely.
so yeah, the phenomenon had been recognized, but nobody had researched it in a serious way, and I think the creation of a term was a useful catalyst.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was reading as well that you had thousands of people responding with great sense of relief that they finally had a word or a label to describe their experience.
Yeah. So, I mean, between the publication of our paper on MX, which was something like 2010 and 2015, around 20 people had got in touch with me. And I thought, that's great. This is a novel phenomenon, or at least a phenomenon without a name. Really interesting to have 20 people telling a consistent story. And then after the term was coined, among other things, I gave an interview on Breakfast TV, just a short one, 5 minutes worth. And when I got back to my room, I found emails coming in, actually, many per second. And I think that since 2015, yes, I've heard from about 20,000 people, most at the
Wow.
low end of the spectrum, mostly with aphantasia, but a fair proportion up at the high end with hyperphantasia. So I think there was there was a constituency of people who were interested in this because they'd recognized that there was something slightly different about themselves, and having a term or terms with which to describe this was helpful to them in communicating with others. And many of them were pleased that someone was paying some attention to this interesting, neglected phenomenon.
Right. It kind of makes it even more puzzling to me how so many people resonated with that experience. And the prevalence seems to me maybe between 2 and 5%. We haven't exactly teased it apart. Like, it's
Yeah.
a lot more prevalent than people ever thought. Yet, vast majority of the people in the world still don't know what the term means, still don't know what it is. Even neuroscientists, I speak to neuroscientists every single week, they often don't know the label aphantasia. I'll go into, a deficit in visual imagery, and then they'll be like, yes, I've heard of that. But it's still not very well known.
Yeah.
And again, for something to be so prevalent, maybe 1 in 20 people, why do you think it's just so under the radar for so long?
Well, I think it's beginning to get around.
Yes.
It occasionally crops up in soaps now, and
You've made it when
yeah,
it's creeping into
yeah,
the soaps. There you go.
yeah.
That's
And
culture changing, that is.
and it's been mentioned in 1 or 2 novels. So I think it's kind of entering the popular consciousness. I think that the explanation for what you describe is simply that it's still relatively young, and it takes a while for new ideas to get out there. So I think an analogous phenomenon is probably prosopagnosia. So
Right.
this is difficulty in recognizing faces,
Yeah.
which in some people can be very profound, so that they won't recognize their brother or their son at the door until they hear them speak or are given some clue beyond visual appearance. Again, this is maybe we'll come on to discuss this. I don't think aphantasia is a disorder or a condition, so it's not quite analogous with prosopagnosia, which is in some senses a disorder. But nevertheless, it's similar in that people with prosopagnosia often don't realize that they have this difficulty for many years. It takes some particular event, circumstance, trigger to make people realize, because we all take our own experience to be normal.
Yes.
And prosopagnosia is like aphantasia in that there are some people who lose the ability to recognize faces due to some event like a stroke late in life. But for most people with prosopagnosia, it's a lifelong condition. And the reason I mention is that I think similarly, it took prosopagnosia quite a long while to reach scientific consciousness after it was first described.
Right.
And a little, again, like aphantasia, it occurs in just a few percent of people, and be plenty of scientists still who aren't very familiar with it.
I'm really curious. Is there any sense of regret in labeling it as aphantasia, where it's so apparent that there's a deficit there, when a lot of the recent research and a lot of the work that's been done since that coining is really showing that there's upsides and there's downsides. The differences don't seem to be that big. The brain is remarkably plastic and adaptable. So for the people who can't visualize in their mind's eye, they have all of these other strategies for doing things quite well.
Yep.
So I'm curious, is there any thought there where if you were to name it again, would you kind of imply a little bit less of a deficit in the name?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I quite like the term, and it seems to have caught on. So I guess in this case, I would sort of bow to its success.
Yes.
But or to its usefulness. But yes, you're right. Some people have criticized it on the grounds that it might imply a lack of imagination generally, which isn't something that I would have intended, because it turns out that you can lack sensory imagery, lack a mind's eye, lack imagery in all the senses, and yet be very imaginative in the sense of being creative and productive in your thinking, in your work. So it shouldn't be taken to imply a lack of imagination generally. And then, do I regret the fact that it hints at a deficit? Well, not really, because although I don't think it's a disorder, and I absolutely agree that it has pros and cons, there is a kind of deficit there. There's people who with aphantasia seem to have difficulty in doing something that most people can do psychologically. So I don't want it to be pejorative, but I think it's reasonable that it should point to a lack.
I'm not saying you should feel any regret either. I'm just kind of curious, because in 2015 till now, it might have been very easy to assume that there was a much greater deficit, say in 2015, when before the real data has came in on all of these things, because it was very surprising to me that there wasn't a huge creativity difference and there wasn't a very big, it kind of seems like there would be, but again, this is other minds' problem, where because I solve my problems in these ways, I assume that because they don't have this thing, that there isn't an adaptive strategy there. So
that's exactly right. So you might wonder, and many people do wonder when they first hear about this, how can people with aphantasia remember things or think at all in the absence of imagery? And indeed, what many philosophers have written over the centuries would suggest that people who lack imagery would be very disabled by that lack. And one of the intriguing things about aphantasia is that turns out not to be the case. In most respects, people with aphantasia get along very well. There are one or two interesting areas of difficulty, which maybe we'll come on to. But it does seem that either, as you've hinted, people with aphantasia find other ways of doing things that don't involve imagery, or there is the intriguing possibility that they use something like unconscious imagery in their thinking, which doesn't give them an experience, but nevertheless can inform their thoughts and performance.
Interesting. Yeah, well, we were talking very briefly beforehand, and regular listeners of the podcast will know now that my sister has aphantasia, and she's been very creative her whole life. Like, she ran a jewelry business, and now she's an editor on the podcast. She's remarkably creative. Like, she's 10x more creative than I am. And, we both did a VVIQ score, and I kind of am in the hyperphantasic side, even though I don't know if I fully agree with that. I think I'm probably middle of the road. And she was perfect 16, which is like black on black for basically every scene.
Yeah.
Yet she's far more creative than me. And another one that I think is just funny and puzzling is that she moved house recently, and she said that she was imagining what the house is going to look like right away. And she knew exactly all the changes she was going to do in every room, and, paint this color. I don't know what that means in her mind when she says all those things, and she has moved in now and the place looks incredible, but we're both kind of laughing to each other of like, how the hell did you know to do this? Like, you knew that green looked good on that wall, but you didn't picture it because you can't. And you knew that a tile here would look really good, but you couldn't picture it. So, like, how are they doing this? I just thought it was so interesting.
No, that's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think it's worth saying that having vivid imagery does seem to nudge people a little in the direction of traditionally creative trades. So there is some relationship of the kind that you might predict, but it's certainly not by any means true across the board. And one of the things that startled us in the kind of initial phase of the research was that a lot of aphantasic artists got in touch.
Yeah.
People who said that they loved the visual world, And that, if anything, their aphantasia was a spur to visual creativity. Because if you can't reproduce things in your mind's eye and you want to celebrate them, you want to evoke them, then you have to do it in some other way, on paper or in sculpture and so forth. So yes, the relationship
Cool.
is quite a complicated one. I think conscious visual imagery it's fascinating. It probably does have some uses, but it's clearly just one small piece in that great psychological jigsaw that makes a bus.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free